The northern half of the African continent is represented by the Saharan plateau. The Sahara has kept in the folds of its old, massive traces of the multimillennial struggle between men and aridity. The Sahara is one of the largest and most hot deserts in the world. Who were the actors in this fight against aridity? Who were these ancient Homo sapiens who lived in the Sahara? It is about establishing a typology from their kinds of life. In relation to paleoclimatic oscillations, we will wonder about their area of origin. This last aspect will allow us to ask the question of whether the Saharans were black or white from the Upper Paleolithic, 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, and Neolithic. These ancient Saharans marked their fingerprints on several corners and recesses of the Saharan plateau. This was before the desert appeared. The documentation consists essentially of the findings of archaeological surveys. It is rock art, the readings of which, since the work of H. Bruhl and L. Frobenius, allowed the constitution of a corpus. The documentation also features weapons, tools, and utensils found in rock stations which were of critical importance. Along the way, we will report certain passages from classical sources relating to Ethiopian populations, aka black people from ancient Libya, which includes the Mediterranean coast and the Saharo-Sudanese zone of Africa. At the end of the Tardiglacial, during the collapse of the Bovidian culture, towards the middle of 3rd millennium BC, the Sahara had known several waves of settlement. This was the standard during the post-glacial wet phase and lake transgression, which lasted up to 5,000 years ago. Among these populations, we distinguish A. The hunters. They were the authors of the oldest cave engravings obtained by incision and hammering. The style is a naturalist. The hunting culture seems to have died out around 7,000 BC. B. The fishermen, generally aniconic. They were the origin of the oldest ceramics of the Sahara. The remains at Tiltekin, a hagar, are dated around 7,200 years ago, and that of Tinthora, Akakus, is dated around 7,100 BC. C. The Bovidians, authors of paintings. They often cohabited with hunter populations who still produced wildlife engravings. Their cattle, the dominant silhouettes of their paintings, are those of the domestic Bos breeds. This is the most consistent Neolithic proof in the Sahara. What has each of these groups has brought to Sahara? The hunters were already in the Sahara between 40,000 and 21,000 years ago. During this period, they had created the so-called Arterian industry. The Tardiglacial desert forced them to flow back to the south and southwest of the African continent. They were going to reoccupy the Sahara in favor of the humid Holocene between 15,000 and 5,000 years ago by bringing the parts of the Epipaleolithic lamellar industries like the Halfian and Balanian of the Middle Nile, as well as the Unanian. These are treated as true inventions, since these industries do not derive from the Arterian. There is even a break between the Arterian culture and these cultures in terms of size, product, and techno-complex. In Mediterranean Africa, the Epipaleolithic industries have superimposed themselves on phase 3 of the Arterian. They are non-native, while the most former Epipaleolithic industry in North Africa, i.e. the Ibero-Mauritian, is dated at the earliest of 12,000 BC. In Nubia, the Epipaleolithic goes back to 18,000 to 16,000 BC. Therefore, chronologically, Sudan has outstripped Mediterranean Africa in terms of technological performance and cultural outcomes. The most ancient Homo sapiens who arrived in North Africa, where Thry developed the so-called Ibero-Mauritian industry, could not have come from Europe. At the time, around 12,000 years ago, and until the extinction of the Capsian around 4,500 years ago, navigation was not yet practiced in the Mediterranean. We note that in Nubia, the Balanian is originated 14,000 years ago, and the Halfian, at the Second Cataract, around 16,000 BC. It then appears that Upper Nubia, Second and Third Cataracts, and Northern Sudan experienced a profusion of Upper Paleolithic industries. Tixier speaks of an African epigavetien, from where the other lamellar industries would derive. This invasion of the Sahara from the Middle Nile explains the affinities observed between the Ibero-Maurusian of the Maghreb and the Nubian Kadan. He reports the similarities between the lithic tooling of Eshahainab in Sudan and that of the southern Sahara, the valleys of the Tenere Tefasa and various rivers, then descending from Tibesti and Hogar, probably served as axes for migratory movements. In the Middle Nile Valley, the hunters created the Sebekian, which was brought closer to the Unanian and the Ibero-Maurusian, the Halfin, the Balanisan, and the Kadan. In Egypt, their industries are the Sebilian and that of Helouan. These hunters invading the Sahara in favor of the Chadian pluvial and lake transgression developed the culture of the Ark. Their engravings represent wild fauna, which feeds a hunting people. It is a naturalist art, produced by the incision technique. It is also characterized by monuments. In the decor, there are predominant serpentine patterns. Attested at the Upper Epipaleolithic, this type of paintings, dominated by Ethiopian wildlife, was in vogue. At Harar, during the Upper Paleolithic, on the walls of the Pok-Spik Cave at Dire Dawa. Note that the Sibyllian link to the art of hunters has spread from Nubia to Egypt. The Nubian engravings of the Gebel Gorgod are older than those, further north, from Fezzan, and their creators already existed in Ethiopia, in Lagoda. This means that engraving was invented by Nilo-Sudanese populations during the Epipaleolithic and spread by these same Sudanese who reoccupied the Sahara and arrived at Tassili around 9000 BC. This art of hunters began their extinction around 7000 BC, leaving room for the art of pastoralists, which consists mainly of paintings. The presence of fishermen in the Sahara is attested by the nets represented at Oued Jorat, Tassili. Their attachment to the Middle Nile lies in the fact that at the time of the occupation of the Sahara during the Tardiglacial Desert, in the Middle Nile, a culture developed based on the exploitation of rivers. The Nilo-Sudanese centers of this culture are fishing camps, catfish sellers, like Khartoum and Eshahainab. From there, this culture descended along the course of the Nile and arrived in Upper Egypt. In the Saharan plateau, the fishermen bring the sub-schematic style, which is superimposed on the naturalism of the hunters. This style was already in vogue in Surrey, Ethiopia, then in Nubia Dakhle and Karge. Fishermen have developed capsoid industries. This is the case of phase 2 of the Sibyllian culture, the Shamarkian culture of Nubia and the Aburan culture Kenyan. The lithic industry consists of slats on felled boards, geometric microliths, as well as chisel and microburins. There are differences in percentages and in terms of matter. The Kenyan Aburan culture from the 8th to 6th millennia BC mainly utilized obsidian, a stone that the Egyptian embalmers of the dynastic period will use later. The central Sudanic populations that participated in this invasion of the Sahara brought the Unan tip from the so-called Unanian industry. With the fishermen, we already have Neolithic cultures. In the Sahara, the Nilo-Sudanese bring the pottery they invented to boil mollusks in catfish cellars from Sudan at the Makkalian culture sites around 7,000 years ago. Their mentality as fishermen is illustrated by the decor of this pottery in wavy lines, wavy and dotted wavy lines, which evoke the image of the surface of watercourse caressed by the breeze. The similarities between Saharan, Nubian, Nabta Playa, and Khartoum, red pottery with a decorated wavy black edge, reflect the arrival in the Sahara of men living by the exploitation of rivers coming from the Nile Basin. The Holocene pluvial and the lake transgression allowed the development of such a kind of life in the Saharan plateau. The persistence of aridity in the lower Sahara did not allow fishermen to settle there. Also, in this area, pottery, grinding wheels and mops are rare. The grinding wheels are known in Nubia from the Cadian. They are an element of a current Neolithizing who established itself in the massifs during the 7th millennium. In Nubia, at Nabta Playa, this current is attested to the same period. At 7th millennium, the culture of fishermen from the Great Lakes of Kenya was at its peak. It was the source of Nubian pre-Neolithic cultures, Kadan, Shamakian, focused on the exploitation of waterways. The oldest pottery in Enedi came from the Nile Basin. They brought in the fishing reinforcement and the barbed bone harpoons. In Egypt, they bring the gouges of Esh-Shahanab from where the club disc would have come. These fishermen were already breeding with ox bones found at their stations. It's in the Sudanese catfish cellars that these fishermen had started domestication, goats first, to improve their food. There lies a certain difficulty when it is necessary to distinguish the fishermen and pastoralist stations. In the Sahara, pastoralists developed the Bovidian culture. They were the authors of the cave paintings in which the silhouette of domestic animals predominate. Their paintings express the most common, the kind of life in the Neolithic Sahara, which was, and of, pastoralism and nomadism. The Bovidian culture coincides with the climax of the Saharan Neolithic. It constitutes the time periods of 3500 to 2000 to 1500 BC. The first demonstrations in Tibesti date from the 6th millennium BC. Thus, Neolithic culture seems to have been prepared by the Epipaleolithico, which Sahara was not a hotbed of elaboration. In Ethiopia, Nubia, Sudan, there has been a proliferation of Epipaleolithic industries, a rural Epigravetian, at the start of the Tardiglacial Desert. This is where the Neolithic variant of Sudanese tradition, which was brought to the Sahara. It is to this fact that we can identify the tradition of Tartessos reported by Strabon, who got it from Ephor. The same fact is well illustrated by the Wadi Sheikh site, rich in mines, flint, picks, hoes, etc. Animal domestication was acquired in catfish cellars from Mesolithic Sudan. The Bovidian culture started from the Tibesti region of Chad. The bovine species of the rock paintings and whose images eventually become Medu Neter signs are of the taurine race, humpless cattle, which is endogenous, unlike the Zebu race, of Asian and more precisely Indian origin. From Nilo-Chadian Sudan, the Bovidians conquered the Sahara towards its central and western portions. Towards the north, they bring their culture to Uenat, Fayum, and in Tripolitania. From Tibesti, the Bovidians arrive at Tadrata Kakus around 4730 BC, and at Tassili around 3500 BC. The provenance of the Bovidia culture from the Nile Basin explains the fact that in the Sahara, the Neolithic in its pure state is attested only in the south, in Aselar, Tafajit, Meniet, Amekni, Toboi, Gabrong, and Delebo. The Tibesti itself is turned towards the Middle Nile Valley. Its rock stations are on the eastern flank of the massif, facing the course of the Nile. Here, the Bovidian culture is dated 6000 BC. In the then wet Saharan plateau, the Bovidians imposed their kind of life. Also, rock stations are not associated only to Neolithic material. The Bovidians coexisted in the lower Sahara, with hunters who kept a kind of Epipaleolithic life for a long time. The latter are the authors of paintings like that of Ain Naga representing a Bubal. The Neolithics who occupied the Thalweg represented, in the same station, a spheroid ram. 4. The ancient Saharans. Who were these ancient Saharans? Yes, we consider that the retreat of the Tardiglacial Desert took place from 15,000 BP from south to north. It must be concluded that the hunters who then invaded the Sahara could only come from equatorial Africa. In the representations of their paintings, they appear as archers wearing a phallic sheath and Negro masks. As for fishermen, their presence in the Sahara is attested by hooks and nets, harpoons, and other armatures. They were, in all probability a branch of the authors of the pre-Neolithic Nubio-Sudanese complexes, who are related to the cultivation of fishermen. In the Saharo-Mediterranean regions, pottery is rare. The pottery was known as basketry by the fishermen of Upper Nile and probably served to boil shells. As for the Bovidian culture, she was born around Tibesti between the 5th and 6th millennium. It then spread in the Sahara during the 4th millennium. Through their paintings, the hunters and Bovidians were great archers. Now it seems that their RC weapon was invented in sub-equatorial Africa. During the Tardiglacial arid in these regions, a culture called Chitolian developed. The richness of this culture in armatures of arrowheads allows us to think the arc was in use there. It was only the culmination of processes attested to in Pembo Chitolian complex. At the time, jet weapons predominated. The southern origin of the Bovidians is illustrated by the fact that the Neolithic homes in which they participate have started their hatching from 7th millennium. In the old Saharo-Sudanese massifs. From there, the culture was transported throughout the Sahara. The hunters, fishermen, and Bovidians of the ancient Sahara were therefore blacks. It is the analysis of the paleoclimatic context that suggests it, and not the anthropological features. It was only after the fall of the Bovidian in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, following the extension on the Saharan plateau of pejorated climatic conditions, and following the eruption of Eurasians in the Mediterranean. G. Kempis has already shown that it is from the 2nd millennium BC that these pale-skinned populations appeared in North Africa, known by the Egyptians of the New Empire. They are represented on the tomb of Seti I. These populations from Eurasian sources were designated by the pharaonic term Ribu, Libo. The man of Asalar and the lady of Amekni show very well the black character of the populations of the Bovidian Sahara. These two people practiced the avulsion of the incisors, custom attested in the Nubian Mectoids. Always in Amekni, the child who was 1.25 men resting and dated at 4850 years ago was a black African. The same is true for the skeleton of Uwan Muhugyag, dated 3455 BC. The skeleton found under the rock at Tadrata Kekus and dated 3446 years ago was also that of a black African. By this term, you have to include a person with black skin, the size above average. The browning arcades are generally protruding. The nose has a deep notch and the lips are thick. You must not fall into utopia, that is to say, seek an individual in whom all these traits are present. Fishing populations whose Nubia, A group, was a branch, were also black Africans like anthropomorphic representations of Tibesti. The archer of Safar, whose body is painted in black and the hair dyed in light, also belonged to these black populations of the Neolithic Sahara. Conclusion. At the end of this study, one of the conclusions that can be formulated is that the human map of the current Sahara is not an offset from that of older Epipaleolithic and Neolithic in particular. Unlike literature, which shows a certain confusion in mixing designations, blacks, whites, Mediterranean, Libyans, Berbers, etc., which belong to different lexicosemantic registers, the ancient Sahara, the one before the desert, affirms its racial and cultural affiliation to black Africa. The dark complexion here, slightly clear there, does not change anything. The ethnographic approach that rock art allows is a good illustration of this, reinforced by the paleoclimatology. From the end of the Tardiglacial desert to the collapse of the Bovidian, the northern half of Africa was black. The weak infiltrations of leucoderms from Eurasia have taken place at these ancient times. But the mass arrival of pale Eurasians in Mediterranean Africa did not take place before the 2nd millennium BC.